Kyle Warner is the first full-time vaccine injury lobbyist in the United States and a three-time North American Enduro mountain bike champion. Since his own battle with vaccine-induced myopericarditis in the summer of 2021, Kyle began speaking out to help raise awareness for others who were vaccine injured, and was surprised by the active suppression of their stories. He has been helping with the mission of React 19, a science-based nonprofit offering financial, physical, and emotional support for those suffering from long-term COVID-19 vaccine adverse events. Gaining drive and momentum, Kyle is now lobbying in Washington, D.C. for React 19 during the spring 2024 legislative session to help advocate for fair and timely vaccine injury compensation. Seeking to depoliticize and humanize the issue, we explore the winding curves on Kyle's journey so far, his experience of being interviewed by a New York Times reporter, and how the twisting of words in Big Pharma is making an already complex, corrupt system more deceptive. He also unearths some of what congresspeople are saying behind closed doors. I'm Sienna Mae Heath, and this is Leaving the Left for Liberty. Hey Kyle, it's good to see you.
You too. How are you doing?
I'm well. Thank you.
Mhm.
So, you've been on quite the journey.
Yeah, definitely. It's been, I know, I was telling someone it's a very winding road, but I'm just trying to lean into the curves. So it's like, I don't know, there's a lot happening. I think that being down here in DC the last few months has been very eye-opening. And it's just, I don't know, it's frustrating right now a little bit to see how little hope there is for change to happen, based on the opinion of politicians and other lobbyists and everything. Um, but then at the same time as there's like very little hope at the moment, there's also all these studies coming out constantly of issues and like, FDA and NIH and CDC papers that are heavily redacted, meaning that they're trying to hide something. So there's like a groundswell of information and support, but then at the same time, there's kind of like a lack of hope. So it's like a weird place to be in right now where it's conflicting signals. So I'm just trying my best to do what we can and try to drive some awareness. I appreciate you reaching out and trying to do a little interview, and yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Of course. Well, riding the curves and keeping up that momentum and that drive, as you said, is I feel like that's really evoking the mountain biker in you and like the hero's journey that you're on. And I know from reading your most recent Instagram caption that this journey hasn't exactly been exactly what you expected. But nonetheless, taking on the role of the first ever full-time vaccine injury lobbyist in America is quite the feat, and something that you'll be able to tell to generations to come. And before we really dive into what's going on in DC and the energy you're experiencing, some of the ups and the downs, I'd love to give you a platform to really share the origins of your hero's journey, what your life has been as a mountain biker, and the growth of your YouTube channel in 2020, which was really interesting because as people were quarantined, they were eager to get exercise and to get outside, as controversial as that seemed early in spring of that year. So what has been your journey since you started mountain biking and gaining a platform in 2020, and then finally, unfortunately, falling to vaccine injury yourself?
Yeah, it's been a long journey as well. So when I was about 16 years old, I was having a lot of hard times at school and just in my personal life. My mom was going through a experimental form of treatment called interferon that was basically curing like some hepatitis C she had contracted. And so she was really sick for about 6 or 7 months, and I was going through a lot and kind of like failing out of school and dealing with just that whole home life thing. And so I wanted to try to find an escape, and that's how I got into mountain biking. And through mountain biking, I really started to get, I guess, my first sense of community. And so that's why I really dove into it and became, I kind of obsessed with it. And over those next few years, like 16, 17, 18, I started riding a lot and trying to start racing. And I turned pro when hit 18 years old, and kind of went on this wild journey of traveling around the world, being a multi-time national champion and that was where the credibility from like the mountain bike world came into play. And then in 2020, all the races got canceled because of COVID, obviously. And at that time, I was just trying to figure out things we could do to basically keep the lights on with sponsors and everything. That's how, I made a living for the whole time since I was 18 years old, is working with brands and being a brand ambassador and sponsors. And yeah, a lot of them were just like, well, there's no races, there's really no advertising. Like, what do we do? And so they had the idea, like, why don't you start doing YouTube videos and do, tutorials? And yeah, basically, like, I leaned into that idea. And my partner at the time, April, was, really eager and willing to learn. And she is a professional motocross rider as well. So she had kind of that skill set and background. And we started doing tutorial videos, and yeah, it just kind of took off like wildfire. So I remember the first video got like 14,000 views, and I was, shocked. I'm like, oh, that's so good. And then the second one got 1 million views, and we're like, oh my God. And then the third one got 1 million views. And then like, yeah, the first three videos all within a month were basically over 1 million. And one of them hit 5 million views. So it was like learning how to wheelie. And yeah, our channel just started picking up a lot of steam. We were growing at about 1,000 subscribers a day throughout that whole summer, and just kind of rising up. And YouTube actually gave us the award of like creator on the rise, which was really cool. So it's like fastest growing creator on the platform at that time. And they featured us on the homepage of YouTube for a whole day for 24 hours, which is like massive, PR. So it's just like millions and millions of impressions. So yeah, that was really cool. And then April, she left her job at the end of that year to try to pursue YouTube with me full time. And with us doing tutorial videos, there was really good opportunity to take that into in-person coaching clinics and basically travel around the country and teach people in person, like the skills I'm teaching April online. And that was really our big goal for 2021, was to build out our van, get it all set up to go travel, and then hit the road and do tutorials. And one of the big barriers to that was basically, teaching and being in confines with people. We didn't want to get anyone sick, and a lot of our audience was 40 plus, like people that came into mountain biking later in life and couldn't really afford to hit the ground and learn that way. So they wanted to get good instruction and learn in a safe manner. And yeah, we just kind of, listened to what the government said. Basically at that time, the the thought process was, if you get the vaccine, you're not going to get sick, you're not going to transmit COVID, you're not going to catch COVID, you're not going to die from COVID, like, and essentially you're going to protect everyone around you. And without doing a ton of research, we talked to our neighbor who is a nurse, and he said, go for it, it's safe. We talked to our other neighbor who is a teacher. She had also gotten it. And so we just made the decision based on, kind of the statements from the government, and then just our close circle in our neighborhood, just to go ahead, and it seemed like it was worth it. Now, looking back, I've learned a lot more, and also learned just how susceptible young, healthy men were to reactions. There's a really interesting study about the fact that, so I guess I roll back a little bit, but the spike protein is one of the potential mechanisms they think is causing some of the heart inflammation. It could be a mixture of autoimmune disease, spike protein, or the lipid nanoparticle itself could be problematic. And so there's a few different mechanisms of action, but one really interesting thing is that endurance athletes express more of a receptor called ACE2 on their heart. And so if it is a spike protein issue, the heart, well, like, I guess spike protein docks at the ACE2 receptor. So if your heart has more ACE2, there's more spike going to it and docking potentially. And that's maybe one of the explanations for why young, healthy endurance men are having this issue. So, long story short, yeah, got my first shots in May, and that whole month I was a little bit off, and nothing drastic, but I was just really tired and felt kind of a lot of anxiety. It's not like mental anxiety, but just like my body was going through a lot of stress, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And so I spent a lot of time that month, like off and on, laying on the couch, resting, relaxing. And I actually sent a message to one of my friends, just asking him about some treatments he had done to try to help with fatigue, like mass fatigue. I was like, man, I feel so tired. I don't know what's going on. And then we got our second shots on June 10th. And yeah, basically that made the symptoms get even worse. And then a month to the day of the second shot, I went out on a mountain bike ride, and my heart rate ran away on me. I had a really bad kind of chest cramp and pain. really flushed, and I couldn't get my heart rate to come down for about 2.5 to 3 hours. It was stuck above 130, and I couldn't get it to come down, which is not normal. Like usually my resting heart rate's in the 60s or, high 50s. And so, yeah, ended up going to the hospital, kind of had a gaslight experience there the first time, got sent home after being observed for a while and being given a big shot of a steroid, anti-inflammatory, and then just told to kind of see what happens. And about 3 days later, I had another episode where heart rate ran away, big chest cramp and squeeze, not sure what's happening, go to the hospital. They finally take me seriously, and then I get diagnosed with myocarditis, pericarditis. So that was, yeah, that was kind of my journey. Um, but it was a very tumultuous time because in 2021, there wasn't a lot of people speaking out about what was happening. And so I also was a bit naive because I had been so busy with the YouTube thing and just trying to grow the channel for 2020. I really wasn't in tune with how divisive the whole COVID landscape was. I wasn't very in tune to politics. I wasn't really in tune to much at the time. I was just editing and working, probably 80, 90 hours a week trying to get the YouTube channel running so April could quit her job. And yeah, I just was out of touch. And so when I had my injury, I actually did just a video saying, "Hey everyone, this is what I had happen to me. Like I'm dealing with this heart issue. I don't want this to be political. It's just this is my story, and this is why we've been quiet." And that got picked up quite a bit. And then a doctor from the UK, John Campbell, reached out and said, "I want to have you on the podcast and to share your story." And I agreed. Again, kind of naively, I thought he was maybe just a random dude with a small channel. Turns out that video goes like kind of mega viral and gets several million views and like I think over 30,000 comments. And reading through that and then just having the exposure from people sending emails and messages, I realized that this problem was a little bigger than just myself. And I kind of got involved with the, I guess you could say, movement, or just like trying to help people that were injured after that.
Right. And something you mentioned was the politicizing of one's very own body and our well-being, the desire to even be active became politicized. And now we're learning more about why strong, healthy athletes, male athletes, were more susceptible. I think the more reactionary assumption back then was, oh, this vaccine is so terrible that even strong male athletes are susceptible. But it turns out that they are more susceptible for scientific reasons.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting data. And one of the biggest points of frustration I've had throughout this whole process, like learning, things that have come out in discovery, is that in February of 2021, Israel, which is a very healthy country, basically sent a note to the CDC saying, "We are seeing an increased rate of young men developing myocarditis and heart issues with COVID vaccine. We basically are urging you to create a warning and recommend that young men are notified of this or potentially don't proceed with taking the COVID vaccine." And so the CDC drafted a memo in May of 2021, and then last second they withheld the memo and didn't actually publish it. And so since basically February of 2021, the CDC knew that there was a likelihood that young men who are athletic would have issues. And instead of basically just putting out a memo, they just redacted it, didn't put it out, and then that could have completely changed the course of myself and many other people's journey. Because, at the time, it was hard because even at the time, like when I went to the hospital and we were trying to figure out what was going on, they're like, what's happening, what's changed, what's going on in your life that could cause this issue. And I was like, dude, the only thing I can think of is I had my COVID shots like a month ago. And I think it was the week before, a few days before, I just read one little headline on Google News. I just scroll the news every once in a while, and one of the headlines said, believe it was Germany. Germany sees increase of young men with like myocarditis post Moderna vaccine. And so I saw that, and that was just in my head a little bit of like, I don't know, I saw this, I got my shot recently. It could maybe be linked, I'm not sure. And the doctor at the time was really dismissive of it. But if the CDC would have put out a memo linking the same thing in American science, I think it would have really helped facilitate better care, and I wouldn't have been gaslit so much the first time. And yeah, it's just really, I don't know, it's frustrating because like these agencies are just working on behalf of the companies to essentially make the product as, I guess they're also worried about people being hesitant and not taking the product because they may think genuinely that it does work. There's also the possibility that they don't really know or care if it works. They're just trying to profit off of it. And, everyone has a different opinion on which way that skews. But yeah, it's just frustrating that they're being warned by other countries about this and then withholding information from the people. And so that was something that I've been frustrated about.
Yeah, and those two narratives or points of view bring to mind a more recent experience you had in being interviewed by a New York Times reporter. And as I understand, he or she, I guess, accused you of, or just generally accused the movement of promoting vaccine hesitancy just by speaking out. I know you've said, among others, that when you duct tape someone's mouth, of course, they're going to yell louder.
Yeah.
And could you share more about what your response was to the New York Times piece, and how suppressing stories of vaccine injury can actually be a larger issue, for the not just not just for the individual or the quote unquote small group of people, but just for the larger whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what it really highlights is this idea that most information in today's age is operating within of silos. And so, like, you have basically your news coming from one silo on the left or one silo on the right, but it's very rare that you're actually getting disseminated information from both that is true. So it's kind of heavily skewed one direction or the other. And again, like that New York Times reporter, when he reached out, he was working on an article called Why the Vaccine Injured Are Fueling the Anti-Vax Movement. And it's frustrating because what I kind of explained to him is, yeah, you can see it that way. But personally, if I had my injury, I would have loved to have just filed a claim, gone through the due process, proved to them that it was because of the vaccine, and then gotten compensated and like moved on with my life. And I know tens of thousands of other people that would have loved to do the same thing as well. And by you not providing like a reasonable remedy to this situation, then we are going to advocate for ourselves and we're going to create hesitancy by expressing the truth. So I think if the truth creates hesitancy, then maybe it deserves to be hesitant. Like people deserve to be hesitant if the truth creates hesitancy. So I don't know. I just feel like it's an odd argument to say, yes, you have a misrepresented skew of how popular or how, I guess, common this injury is. And so by you having an outsized voice, then you're making it seem like it's happening at a higher rate than it is. But how do we know how much it's happening if people aren't linking it because no one's talking about it? So it's like if you didn't know that it could cause heart issues and you got the shot and 3 weeks later you had pericarditis and you had no idea, then maybe you wouldn't bring it up to your doctor that you had had the shot. And so then maybe that goes undiagnosed as vaccine injury. But at the end of the day, I'm a big proponent of like tell people the truth, give the populace the, I guess, confidence or trust that they can handle the truth, and then see what decisions they make from there. And at the end of the day, like it's a free market or it should be a free market. And if the truth causes hesitancy, then maybe it's warranted. And it's up to the agencies to basically say, hey, yes, we are seeing an increased rate in young, healthy men. That's why this story does make sense. And if you're not a young, healthy man, then don't worry about it so much because you're less likely to have an issue. So again, it's like by them withholding pieces of truth, then it makes us telling the truth even less palatable to the average American. Whereas if they would have just shared openly what they're finding and hearing, then it would have helped us a lot. So yeah, I kind of told him the only way forward to like reduce vaccine hesitancy is to increase the safety net. And essentially you're asking people to walk on a tightrope and you have nothing below them. And so a lot of people are going to be hesitant. And if you put this massive safety net out where people could fall off and still move on with their life and get continuing care costs and, basically get help back up, then yeah, they'd be more willing to walk across. So
Mm.
that's kind of where at now I feel.
Right. So the main shift in the movement that I've seen is a shift from, not so much a shift, but a development, from elevating your stories and, just telling your stories in Congress, on YouTube, being very emotional and vulnerable and having it understandably fueled by emotion. Because I can't imagine, feeling that isolated. I think the pandemic, especially if you were in any sort of small group or minority opinion, was incredibly isolating. I mean, we know that the suicide rates were so high. And finding yourself in that group of the vaccine injured during the pandemic, what role did you see emotion playing? And were you finding a balance of like emotion and reason being helpful, and say going on podcasts and speaking with doctors who actually were listening to you and could add that level of maybe some affirmation, really, and just plain research to say, hey, essentially, you're not crazy, you don't deserve to be gaslit, and these stories deserve to be heard?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that emotion, it's really difficult because this is what has faced kind of the, I guess you would say, or what people say, like the legacy anti-vax movement, which is really, if you boil it down, the majority of people who are legacy anti-vax are mothers who had a child that was injured and they're fighting for their child. And they get called crazy because they're emotional because their baby was hurt. And so, like, you're going to have emotional mothers that are angry, pissed off at the system it's not working, that them and their child have been left behind. And yeah, there's a lot of emotion and vitriol behind that. And I think what's happening now is COVID vaccines are different because it generally affected adults more often. There's a couple reasons for that. One of the reasons is that the Pfizer adult dose is like 30 micrograms of RNA. And then the childhood dose is, I believe, 15 for 12 to 16-year-olds. So it's 15 micrograms. And then like the younger dose is somewhere around 3 micrograms. So they scaled the RNA amount based on the size of the person. So it's like there's also less likelihood the kids were going to have an issue because there's less RNA. But anyways, a lot of the people that were affected are adults and they're going to bat for themselves. And so we have for the first time this ability to really advocate in a way that is based on logic and fact and science, and instead of primarily being based on emotion. And I mean, don't get me wrong, a lot of those parents have actual facts and science behind them, and a lot of them do get help. But yeah, it's hard because when a child is injured, the mother is basically going and saying, my baby used to be this way, then it had this shot, and then now it's different. And unless there's really good photo and video evidence, then you're just taking these moms at their word for it, that their baby used to be healthy and then this happened, now it's not. And a lot of times it's not well documented. Whereas many of the COVID vaccine injured people had lived a life of normalcy all the way up to this point, and then you get the shots and your whole life changes, and it's a little easier to explain and show that. So yeah, I'm hoping now, like you said, a lot of the stories are out there. I think the fact that the censorship has gotten much less, it's easier for like little stories to pop up, and it's just kind of everywhere you look. If you just want to find a COVID vaccine injury, you can just type it in and you'll find a bunch of different stories or articles or scientific publications talking about it. So now really what we need to do is focus on how do we fix the problem that we've created. And for a lot of people, it's unfixable. Like if you lost your child, or you lost your dad, or you lost your mom to a heart attack or stroke or potentially another affliction, that's unfixable and no amount of money will ever help. But hopefully we can at least get a little bit of justice for those people, and then we can also help people that have continuing care costs. Two people that are on the board of the React 19, they have over $40,000 a month of continuing care costs because of intravenous immunoglobulin injections. So IVIG, they're paying over $400,000 a year for IVIG, and that's been for 3 years now, basically. So these people they're in a bad spot too. They're going through a lot of cash reserves, and they just need help. So how do we get them help? And that's what I'm kind of focused on right now, is like, how do we reform the system? How do we help the mothers that do have injured babies that are not from COVID vaccines? How do we help people that had flu shot injuries? How do we help COVID vaccine injuries? Um, Basically, there's kind of this subset of medications that has been classified as something different. And the reason that it's different in the way that it affects people is because the companies have liability shields. And so unlike something like Vioxx, where, you know, the company's putting out a product that injures people and they end up killing 38,000 people from Vioxx, and then they pay this massive, you know, $4.5 billion lawsuit, like they were able to go after the company directly. But for us, if someone gets injured or anything, you're not allowed to go after the company. You have to go through these programs, which have been completely gutted. And there's no way for people to get quick help or any help most of the time. So a lot of parents are in the system for at least, like, if they do have a VICP claim that is from a vaccine that's in that program, a lot of them are minimum of a year and a half trials. Some of them are 3 years, and there's even more that are like 4, 5, 6, 7 years before you get help. And so I don't know, it's just interesting that these liability shields really are unconstitutional. It wasn't how it was designed. And I think over time, our goal is to raise enough awareness to really address that and look at the fact of like, are liability shields okay? And how can this work without them? But I don't know, it's just pharma is so powerful and there's so much money and energy and just like indoctrination in the system itself of like, this is how we do it and this is how it needs to continue to be done. But yeah, it's been interesting kind of walking through the halls of Congress, talking to different people. Right now, there's like 5 or 6 different possible pathways through bills that could help, and we're trying to figure out which is the right path. And each of them have their pros and cons. So I don't know. It's frustrating. It's Yeah, I'm hopeful. Like I do think something will change. I just don't know which direction it's going to go. And I can explain more, I guess, if you want, like the nuance of that, but it's also a little bit like it's a little detailed, so it's kind of maybe not the most interesting to talk about, but it's just crazy where we're at as a country.
Hmm. Well, I would love to explore the nuance, and also I believe there's at least two primary bills that you're focused on. So yeah, feel free
Yeah.
to explore that in greater detail or expand on that.
Yeah. So for people that are interested, basically, if you do have a COVID vaccine injury, then the COVID vaccines were approved under something called an emergency use authorization, and that was under an act called the PrEP Act. What the PrEP Act did is it basically gave the companies the ability to give the American people products that were sped up through testing, and the companies were not comfortable selling the products to people without these liability shields. So the government and the companies came into an agreement called the PrEP Act saying, unless you guys commit willful fraud, then we will protect you and we'll protect ourselves as well as the government. So we're not going to be open to lawsuits. You're not going to be open to lawsuits. And anyone who gets injured will get put in this program called the countermeasures program. The countermeasures program, in the life of the program, has had 13,000-ish claims, and 12,000 of them are from COVID. So, so COVID-19 claims and monoclonal antibodies and respirators and remdesivir, those are like the 4 classifications of things that are basically in countermeasures. In the 20 plus years leading up to COVID, there had only been around 1,000 claims and only 35 people had gotten compensated.
Hmm.
So that program is very, very small. It's very limited. The burden of proof is very high. And those 34 claims, the average payout was somewhere around $680,000. But there were a few claims that paid a lot, and most of them paid much less. Moving forward, CICP currently has 9,800 COVID-19 vaccine claims in it. The average payout, they've approved 11 claims for funding. The 11 people that have gotten paid got an average of $3,700. So there's been, I think, 4 cases of myocarditis that have been approved, and the average myocarditis payout is around $1,100 to $1,800. And then anaphylaxis is a little bit higher, but a lot of injuries like Guillain-Barré, peripheral neuropathy, even death is not really covered, and so no one's getting paid for that. They've rejected 1,300 claims so far out of those 11,000 that were filed originally, and 1,200 of those 1,300 that have been rejected were rejected on the basis of missing the filing deadline of 1 year. So you have 1 year from date of injection to file. If you miss that deadline even by an hour, then you're done. And you don't have any right to an appeal. You don't have a right to an attorney. You don't have a right to due process. If you get a rejection on your claim, you can't say, can I try again? It's just, that's final arbiter and you're on your own. So that's where we're at now in current day America is if you get COVID vaccine injured, you're going to get put in the CICP program. You're going to have a 98% rejection rate. And even if you do get approved, your average payout is going to be $3,000. So that's where we're at now. Then there's this other program called the VICP, which is the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. That was established in 1986 under the Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. That has a $250,000 death cap. So if your kid dies, you get paid 250 grand. Your pain and suffering is capped at 250,000 as well. So if you go through immense pain and suffering, then they'll pay you up to 250,000 in that. And then you get ongoing care costs. So some of the settlements in that program have been as high as $20 million. So that's a much, I guess, more reasonable settlement for people that have ongoing care costs. But still, that program has a lot of issues, including the fact that for the entire program, there's only 8 judges, and those 8 judges are hearing all of these cases. Right now, there's 4,000 cases in backlog that these 8 judges have to go through and hear. And then if we were to someday theoretically move the COVID vaccines in, then there'd be another 10,000 claims with still 8 judges. So it's a huge mess. And what the government is trying to do is they're trying to say that all of the people that took COVID vaccines during the pandemic were basically taking in a version called the emergency use authorization version, which is a non-approved, non-licensed product. The COVID vaccine injury, the issue right here is that there's the non-approved, non-authorized products, which were the EUA ones. Then you have the same formula of those vaccines that is approved called the BLA versions. Not many people got the BLA versions. Almost everybody got an EUA version. Even if they do move COVID vaccines into the VICP, they're only going to cover the approved versions. So if you got an unapproved shot during the last 4 years, then you would not be eligible for compensation. So there's a lot here to unpack. Another thing that's interesting is CICP, the claims you have to file within 1 year of the date of your injection. With VICP, you get 3 years from the date of your onset of symptoms. So say you had a vaccine and then in 3 years you get diagnosed with early stage heart failure and they link it to the vaccine. If you're in CICP program, it's been past the 1 year and you're on your own. You can't file for anything. You can't sue anybody. If it was theoretically in VICP, then that could be the onset of symptoms, and then you'd have 3 years from then to file. So there's a lot here. And basically, the VICP is completely broken. The CICP is completely broken. And we're trying to figure out which one is a possible path towards getting help. And I can explain more, but there's basically like 5 different bills right now. And we're trying to figure out which ones to support. The ones that we're most supportive of are these bills from Lloyd Doggett, which is like 5142. And the Doggett bill basically is called the Vaccine Injury Compensation Modernization Act. That would help update the VICP because all of those dollar amounts were set in 1988 and there's been a lot of inflation since then. So it would basically update the dollar amounts to current day. It would allow for more judges. Instead of a ceiling of 8, there'd be a floor of 10. And there's a few other fixes that would go into that program. However, if we do get these bills through, then it opens up kind of this legislative period where there could be amendments made, with the pharma lobby's interests at mind that could kind of break the program even more potentially. So there's a risk there of like, with us using congressional action to get the COVID vaccines added in VICP, there's a risk that pharma would come in and then mess with the program more to make it better for them and worse for the people. So there's a lot of hesitancy and fear from people that have been in this for a long time, like kind of the legacy group, because they want to see VICP stay as a reasonable alternative remedy for childhood vaccine injuries. That's what it was designed as. A few years ago, they moved the flu shot into VICP, and now most of the claims are adults. And so that really changed the landscape of it. And that's when all the claims started to pile up and the program got backlogged. And so now it's slowed down childhood injuries from getting compensated because there's all these adult injuries that are getting flu shots that are injured. When in the past, the flu shot companies were liable and you could just deal with them on a case-by-case basis. But with that being said, if you were to sue the companies, generally they would just crush you with lawyers and burden, like debt burden, until you basically your whole entire life collapsed, and then you would just settle for pennies on the dollar. So that was like the old way. That's why the Childhood Vaccine Act was passed, is because these families were just getting drugged through the mud for years until they lost everything, and then they would settle for pennies on the dollar with pharma. Um, and so yeah, Barbara Loe Fisher and a few other people advocated to get the Childhood Act passed, and they made a huge difference, but it's still it's still not right. And so I know that's actually only probably like maybe 1/10 of the problem. And so like I'm gonna work on a big video or explainer of going through step by step. Here's the problems, here are the people in play, here's what can happen, here's where the issues are. But that's like just a general 30,000-foot view of what's happening. So any questions, go for it.
Well, first I'll say, hearing some of those numbers, it was hard to contain my look of disgust. That even the people that do get help or compensation, they get maybe $1,000 or $3,000 at the most. That's nothing when you really take a look at medical bills and how quickly they can pile up. I imagine, especially when you're being gaslit by doctor after doctor. And I do want to give some of these doctors, I guess, the benefit of the doubt and understand that perhaps there's indoctrination or even like some sort of like internal gaslighting happening. I would like to think that people have good intentions, but I'm a little bit, just a little bit more removed from this circuit than you are. So as you're meeting with Congress people, as you've been networking with doctors, perhaps across a wide variety of perspectives and ideas for solutions. I know this is maybe kind of more of like a personal question, rather than like a socio-political one, but are you finding that like, people have good intentions, or are you finding that there is quite a lot of like corruption and greed in what it is that we're dealing with here?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'll answer that in two parts. So number one is that what I have found is most people are operating off of incomplete information. And so again, they're operating within a silo. And maybe it's like a Democrat who's a doctor who's very pro-vaccine and is saying, you guys are creating hesitancy, these injuries are not happening, we're going to push down this pathway. And it's not that they're looking at the data and then just disregarding it. They're just in whatever way in this echo chamber where the data is not reaching them. And so whether it's their staff assistants or the legislative assistants or people within their office, when we go to their office and say, hey, can I get a meeting with Representative X? Then Representative X is not who we meet with. We meet with the staffer, and then the staffer 5 days later will tell them, oh, hey, Representative X, I met with these anti-vax people and they said that injuries are happening. And the guy goes, I'm not going to pay attention to this. So a lot of them just don't actually know. The other thing I'll say is there's a lot of money to be made with all of this, and it's like one of the most lucrative products in human history. And so it is like this kind of like rose-colored glasses where there's a lot of people who want it to just be a functional product, even if it is causing injury. And there's a lot of broken parts of the system that cause, maybe intentionally or unintentionally, like with VAERS, for instance, because there's the ability to self-report, then basically people are saying you can't trust VAERS. And it's like, okay. And VAERS, for anyone who doesn't know, is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. And so, for instance, there's 1.6 or 1.7 million adverse reports of COVID vaccine injury. But historically, the doctors were supposed to be the ones reporting those injuries. And then there's the option to self-report. And the fact that the doctors were basically not being given complete information, they were thinking the vaccine injuries were not happening at a real rate that they were. And so they would essentially not take the extra time to go in and file a VAERS report unless they had like, really, really, really solid evidence that the COVID vaccines can cause peripheral neuropathy, and this person had it, and then they developed peripheral neuropathy, and I'm going to link it to the COVID vaccine and file a VAERS report. A lot of the doctors just didn't, there's like, I'm just going to let them do it. So the self-reporting aspect has discredited the adverse event reporting system in a lot of ways, and we don't hold the doctors accountable for reporting. And the system is not designed in a way where it can be updated. So say a doctor does report, and there was a testimony this past week about this from Dr. Whalen at the COVID subcommittee hearing, where he basically said, I saw a young man who developed myocarditis post-COVID vaccine. We reported to VAERS. Within 10 days, that child died from heart failure. And so Dr. Whalen went in to go try to update the report saying this is no longer myocarditis, this is a death, but there's no way to update the report. So then he filed an amendment, but then the amendment is on a private database that no one can see. And so the public doesn't have access to the private database. And so theoretically, there are a lot of injuries that we are not made aware of that we can't see on VAERS, where potentially someone went in the hospital, had a diagnosis, then 6 months later, they ended up with heart failure and potentially passed away, but that is not going to be reflected in the data. And so it's just, again, like there's really incomplete data surrounding this entire thing. It's been that way from the start. Some of it's intentional, some of it's unintentional. There's two quotes that I always think about. One is, there's nothing more dangerous than a man who thinks he's doing the right thing. And then the other one, so that's one. And yeah, I don't know. It's just frustrating. It's really frustrating. The second point escaped me right now, but that's one thing that I always think about is like these people do genuinely think they're doing the right thing. And I think at times they can be driving down the wrong path because they're just not willing to look at the data. Um, and it's funny because they say trust the science, but then as science comes out questioning the vaccines, then they're like, oh, you can't trust that science. It's like, okay, well, what do we trust? And you even saw that recently. This is a separate topic and kind of like pulls away from the argument a little bit, but like the ivermectin thing, where the FDA and CDC were saying don't take ivermectin, and then now they just had to redact that and say, basically apologize publicly. And at the end of the day, it's like everyone's operating off incomplete information, and that's why we get really poor results. Like you can't expect clarity if you have incomplete information. So it's frustrating. But I also, yeah, I think that's the reason that generally vaccines take 10 years to develop and not 9 months. And in the fact that the mRNA technology is something new, that's also a difference. And this is something we had never done before. And we rolled it out to everybody, told them to get it, and then had no safety net in play. So it's like, how can you be surprised with those recipes? How can you be surprised that you baked a really terrible cake? Like, it's just, let's have no transparency. Let's rush something. Let's have no safety net. We're going to force it on everybody, and then we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, if it wasn't so tragic, it's almost laughable. Like if I was reading a novel
Yeah.
of this story, I'd be like, honestly, it's pretty predictable.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
the second point, the second
yeah.
quote that I was going to say is never blame malice when stupidity will suffice. That's like another one. So it's like if there is a chance that you could just be ignorant and ignore these things and totally get in the wrong answer, then like generally assume that that's what happened because it's way more common. There is malice, like there is malintent. I think people like Anthony Fauci are completely sociopathic after everything that's come out. And if you ever have read that book, The Real Anthony Fauci, like that is very illuminating. And he seems to have been a sociopath for many years. But yeah, so like there are people that are malicious, but generally, like with a lot of the congressmen and everything, they're not trying to be bad. They just don't have the data. So
Hmm. And when you consider Anthony Fauci, what would you say to the folks who will say, well, like he did cure, was it AIDS? He was fairly active during the AIDS epidemic, right?
yeah, that I mean, that's a big subject of that book is there's a lot around AIDS that he did that in hindsight was really not good for the people as well. But I think even bad people can do good things. So it's like I think that he is someone who has done good over his career for sure. I'm not going to say every single thing he's ever done is bad, but I think he's operating from a place of like sociopathy. So I think that the way he's not listening, the way he's making things up, the way like insulates himself and is not actually willing to talk to us or anyone who's been injured, the way he discredits people that have been injured, the way he says the vaccines are completely safe and effective when they were known to be not safe and effective, the way they redact information, the way they funded things that Obama and these people said don't fund. Like there's a lot of sociopathy and kind of a God complex there that it seems he has. And so yeah, I'm sure he's done great things in his life, and I'm sure he's done kind acts and help people across the street and things like that in his life. But I just think that he operates from a place of like almost a God complex, and he's unwilling to look at the reality of the situation.
Yeah, I would almost be interested to like know more about his childhood and like when that God complex got started, or if maybe more likely it was created by people worshiping him as if he is a god.
Yeah. Yeah. For anyone who, yeah, just try to read the first few chapters of that book. It's really interesting. And there's, I think, I talked to Tony, like the publisher of it, the other day, and there's like 1,200 footnotes. Basically, like, here's exactly where this article is sourced. Here's like the information, and it's a very well thought out, well read article or book. And that's the reason that he hasn't been able to sue about it, because otherwise you would sue for defamation if those things weren't true. But since it's so well sourced, like there's nothing defamatory about it. It's just the truth that paints him in a really negative light. But
Hmm.
I don't know. It's hard because I would like to have conversations with these people. And we actually invited them to one of the Senate hearings we did in 2021. We invited Fauci, Peter Marks, Rochelle Walensky, Janet Woodcock, like all of these key figures in this thing. And we also invited like Albert Bourla and it's a Pfizer CEO, the Moderna CEO, J&J CEO, and basically said, hey, here's like, I think it was 11 injured people and 10 scientists and doctors that are just speaking about this. And again, instead of just showing up and listening for a few hours and just getting some new data, that's maybe like something that they're not bouncing off of. Yeah, they just decided not to show up, and they just like kind of gaslit us again. And then it's almost plausible deniability. It seems like that's something that happens a lot here too, where people, if they're afraid of what they might uncover, they'd rather just not look. And so that's a really common thing too, where they're like, if I look at this, then I have to admit that I know about it. So how about I just don't want to know. And they do that either intentionally or subconsciously. And yeah, it's a really, really interesting place to be. A good example is this past week was actually the World Vaccine Congress here in DC. And so it's like thousands of doctors and scientists come to basically be a part of this conference and talk about technologies of vaccines and development of vaccines. And I actually tried to sign up and go. And I just wanted to talk. Like I would love to learn. I'd love to interface with doctors and scientists. And I got an email just saying, hey, your registration's been canceled and we refunded you. And we only allow people that are in alignment with our goals. And so then I was like, okay, well, maybe this is a mistake, because I tried to just register as myself. So then I registered through React 19, which is a nonprofit. It's the largest care provider. Like we've provided $800,000 in COVID vaccine injury care. America has provided 40. So like we're 20 times more care provider than America is right now. And so I just registered as React 19. And then they said again, you have been canceled. Your thing has been refunded. Do not try to come. Like you're not going to be allowed in. We've notified security. And so I responded and said, our goals are to study, understand, and heal injured Americans. If your goals are not the same, then I could see why we wouldn't be allowed in. But it's like I'm not going to go there and be crazy or cause a lot of drama. Like I just want to talk to the doctors that have answers, and we want to learn. Like I would love to be involved in this stuff. So yeah, it's very interesting. This is where we're at, because like we're being, again, to the media thing, we're just being put in echo chambers, and the doctors are in an echo chamber. A lot of times the vaccine injured are in an echo chamber, and it's kind of like, how do we find the truth of the matter?
Yeah, and I think the truth is in the complexity, as you were describing, the complexity of the system and how attempting to fix one part of the system could then put at risk some of the mothers who are, getting help for their children who were injured in decades past. And I think looking at that complexity, acknowledging what's at stake, um, avoids a God complex, perhaps. I would hope, like just at least being able to state, hey, we know this is complicated, but like we essentially, care about everyone's life. But like there are just acknowledging, like obviously there are some stories that are being suppressed. And I was just fact checking something about the VICP, the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. Is it true that they have $4 billion surplus earmarked to help the vaccine injured
Yeah.
people in
Yeah, they
the
have
country? Okay.
$4.3 billion right now in the program. And so that program gets funded with every dose of vaccine, whether it's flu shot, so any approved VICP vaccine, flu shot, MMR, polio, any of the other ones, HPV, hepatitis B, every dose that's given, 75 cents of that cost goes into the VICP. And so that's how they've like accrued this massive surplus over the years since 1988. But what's interesting too is that that 75-cent excise tax is also in 1988 dollars. So that has never been updated either. So the program is actually kind of underfunded based on the potential injury rate, because right now they have the 4,000 backlog claims of flu shot mostly, and a lot of those aren't being processed quickly. And so we don't really know where this surplus stands, because if you were to compensate and fund all 4,000 of those claims, and then where does that go, like if you have 4 billion and then you go through all 4,000 of these claims, then where is that 4 billion left at? So it's really interesting, but there is a lot of money set aside. Some of the people that I've talked to have said that anywhere from $5 to $7 would be the required excise tax for COVID-19 vaccines, with like the potential injury rate that they carry, to basically self-fund. So, if $5 to $7 from every shot went to this fund, then it would help care for the people that get injured. But yeah, it's that money is there to help people. However, like I said, it was originally intended to help young children. For a vaccine to be added to that program, it has to be recommended by the CDC for use in either pregnant women or children. So that's another really interesting thing. Like a vaccine that is not recommended for children or pregnant women can't be added. And that creates some interesting incentive structures that are at play. Like, for instance, the hepatitis B vaccine is generally afflicting more of an adult cohort, and it was actually designed to be given to like teenagers who are about to start engaging in risky sex activities. But that cutoff isn't like low enough for it to be recommended for children. So then they end up kind of like dropping the age down until they can get it to where it's recommended for the program in a weird way. So there's a lot there like to unpack, and again, that's like its whole own other issue. But we're trying to look at ways like to create a bill that would reduce some of those incentive structures, because one thing that I'm really curious about is there's roughly 250 mRNA technology vaccines in development at the moment, and those vaccines could be from anything from like HIV to cancer to rare autoimmune issues. And theoretically, if they were to create like a prostate cancer vaccine that they gave to every adult man at the age of 40, which helped prevent them from getting prostate cancer, then that would not be eligible for the vaccine injury program because it's not given to children or pregnant women. So I don't know. There's just a lot that needs to be looked at. And talking to the people that helped establish this program, they don't want anything that's basically not a childhood vaccine in the program, because it takes away from the mothers that are struggling, and that makes sense. Yeah, so I don't know. This is a lot. I feel like it's easy to go into the nuance of stuff and then like lose people, but I don't know if you find it interesting or not, but I'm happy to dive as deep as you want.
I do find it interesting. And also one metaphor I found interesting that you've used is that the government's playing Russian roulette with people's lives. And could you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, the thought I have behind that is essentially you're giving 200 million doses of something to the populace, or 200 million people took it. So you have 200 million, I guess, barrels on the gun, and at least by their own estimation, minimum of like 40 out of a million people are gonna get hit with an injury. So that's 1 in 20,000. And if you don't have a safety net established, then you're basically just, shooting bullets until someone gets hit eventually, and then they fall off the tightrope, there's no safety net to catch them, and then their life is ruined. And so that's where we're at right now, is like, instead of having a fair and equitable remedy to people getting injured, the government is basically just saying, we don't really care. As long as we fire enough bullets, we'll make profit, and it'll work out for us in the end. And it's really similar in a lot of ways to what happened with Vioxx. For anyone that wants to look at like a very blatant case of corruption, Vioxx was a blood pressure medication that was causing really severe heart injuries. And they ended up, after this big class action lawsuit, I think it was like Eli Lilly or one of those companies that was making it, but they profited somewhere around $14 billion, ended up killing 38,000 people, and then they had to pay a $4.5 billion fine. And so they still made 10 billion, and they knew they were killing people as they were doing it. And the documents showed that they had conversations saying, this is killing people. And they go, well, we'll just keep selling it like until something happens, because it's just baked into the cost of it, and they still profited a ton. But that's a very easy scandal. If anyone wants to look it up, it's VIOXX. It's Vioxx, and that's a very easy one to just be like, oh my God, this happened in America. It's one of the biggest criminal lawsuits. So I don't know. Stuff like that happens. That's why it's not out of the realm of possibility that they knew what they were doing. But at the end of the day, like, I just am not I decided not to reserve judgment yet. Like, I just want to just keep going down this rabbit hole, see what we can do to affect change. And I don't want to ostracize or alienate people as much as possible, because I mean, a lot of these topics are just really toxic, and a lot of it sounds crazy. And like, I deal with it every day, but it's just funny to hear it's funny to hear the office members and staff members talk candidly about the issue, and then hear what they have to say publicly to basically not raise flags. And I think there is a lot of sympathy for us within the halls of Congress, but there's just not enough sympathy to stand up to the pharmaceutical lobby.
Is it sympathy that's lacking, or is it something else?
Basically, it's the fact that we don't have enough money. Like, if we had more money, if we had $1 billion to lobby with, we would be able to make changes happen for sure. I guarantee it. Because that's what we're fighting, is basically, I think bio had about $980 million last year of lobby money, and pharma had even more. Those are the two main lobbies. Like, bio is the biotechnical, basically like research and development lobby. They have about 1,000 small companies. And then PHRMA is the other lobby, that's pharma. And that one is like the bigger major companies. And so both of them are lobbying like roughly $1 billion a year or more. And if we had a Billy to lobby with, we would be able to affect change too. Sadly, like, that's the truth of it, is if we had more money, we'd get those meetings. And if we had the meetings, we'd be able to change the congressman's mind. But in a year, if you said there's 52 weeks in a year, and if you can have, 10 meetings a week, then that's 500 meetings a year. And if you have 500 meeting slots available and your campaign costs $10 million to run, then you're going to fill it up with 500 campaign donors. You're not going to fill it up with vaccine injured people that have no money that are requesting help. Like, it just doesn't work that way. So on average, to be able to get a meeting with a congressperson, like to actually have a scheduled meeting with them, you have to be at least about a $10,000 donor to their campaign. And that's the only way you'll actually like really get to sit down with them. Otherwise, you're going to be relegated to sitting down with their staff members. And then, on Fridays, the staff members have their notebook and they do a roundtable, and they just go around and tell the congressperson, like, oh, I met with React 19. This is what they care about. And they're trying to get advocacy to change this thing. And that's what the congressperson hears. And then the next sentence is, oh, I met with this lobby and they want this. And so it's like, we don't have the ability to really get those meetings yet because we don't have money.
When we live in such a materialistic society, or one, I think materialistic, kind of putting the adjective there, implies judgment, but just looking at the focus on materialism rather than some other holistic problem solving system or agreement, naturally, yes, like essentially what we need is more money, rather than more sympathy or more unity, however amorphous that word is. Um, and it's in a way good to know that there are people in Congress who, behind closed doors, are expressing sympathy, are expressing desire to to help those whose stories and experiences have been suppressed for too long or at all.
Yeah.
What's an example of something a congressperson has said behind closed doors, and how does it differ from what is actually happening when they're on the
I
floors of
mean,
Congress?
a good example is, I mean, just yesterday I had a meeting with a Republican congressperson and their like head staffer, and the congressperson wasn't in the room, but it's like their head staffer. And I showed him the bills we're advocating for, and he said, I totally agree with you. I think this is your guys' best shot to get something done. It's very bipartisan. He said, I won't endorse it just because it's too toxic. Like we just can't basically stomach getting the phone calls and the emails from people saying, why are you endorsing this bill? So he's like, I support you, and if it went to the floor, we'd likely vote for it, but I can't publicly endorse it or really like say that we will. So that was yesterday. That's just one example. Another example is meeting with someone from one of the pharmaceutical lobbies, and they said, pragmatically, I understand what you guys are fighting for because I have a nephew that was injured, and so like I get it, but as an employee, like we're operating like basically in we're kind of going against each other in a sense because what they want is they want to get the COVID vaccines added to the VICP. But when they do that, the way that they're trying to do it is it won't have the look back window. And so no one who got the emergency use authorized one will be eligible. So it'll only impact people that keep getting COVID shots from here on out, like whenever that passes what they're lobbying for. So what we're really asking for is like retroactivity, meaning that the people that were injured during the pandemic can get help. So it's like those 200 million people that got vaccinated during the pandemic, if they can't get help, but you start helping COVID vaccine injured people moving forward as COVID becomes less and less lethal, then it's kind of a weird thing. It's like you basically ignore the bulk of the injuries, and then you can publicly say, we do compensate for COVID vaccine injury. We do care. We are working on this. We are. It's like, yeah, but you left out every person who took the experimental version even though the formula is the same. Like it got approved with the same formula. So it's the same product. It's just designated differently, and that makes us not covered.
Hmm. I mean, I understand the predicament of wanting equity or equality and still not wanting to fuel the anti-vax movement. Not that that's exactly what's happening, but I understand that line of thought. It's not my own way of seeing it. I know it's not yours as either, but I mean, do you see any risk in some of these changes that you're advocating for in terms of um creating distrust that could be catastrophic? Like if there is another pandemic, and what if there are like what if there is an even more increase in distrust and hesitancy? Is that something you'd want to see during the next pandemic?
Um, I mean, no, and I think that I feel like that's an interesting question because what you're really asking is there public distrust in like health agencies and recommendations? And I say yes, there is like a massive loss of trust right now after the last few years. Did the vaccine injured people create it? No, because we were reacting to the policies that they put into play. So if they would have made better policies, then we would have not been in this predicament at all, and there would have been less of a loss of trust. But I think what we need to do is create pressure right now. Like, I don't know. I mean, tell me your thoughts on that. But like, basically, it's, oh, these people that got screwed by the system are creating hesitancy, not the people who broke the system. It's like you created hesitancy by breaking the system, and we are the byproduct of your broken system. Therefore, you created the hesitancy. If you would have just put the system in a way that actually works, we would have not created hesitancy. So I don't know. It's kind of a weird, it's like a very interesting argument that comes up a lot where they're like, yeah, you guys need to shut up because you're creating hesitancy. And it's like, if you guys would have just compensated us fairly, then we wouldn't have had to speak up. So then, like, who, chicken or the egg, like, who comes first, right? Like, why did you guys approve the PrEP Act if you knew that this could happen? And it's, I mean, at the end of the day, the only answer is we wanted to rush to try to save Americans and to make profit. And so it's like, yeah, but you could have saved Americans and lost a little bit of that profit and just created a better compensation program. So at the end of the day, like it wasn't the saving the American people was not the motivating factor for the way they did it. The motivating factor was we want to maximize profit, because they could have also said, we're going to vaccinate everybody in the country and we're going to create this really robust safety net. And anyone who has an injury, we're going to take care of them. And instead of making $100 billion, we're going to make $50 billion and we're going to take care of anyone who's injured.
Yeah, if it was 3 years ago, I'd be cheering, but I'm sort of gaining some perspective on this, and honestly, I could see even that just being said during the next pandemic. Like, don't worry, we know people were hurt before, but there's a safety net now. So if you get hurt, you'll get thousands of dollars. Like, I don't know that that would motivate even people who took the vaccine and were fine. I don't know that that would motivate them to take another vaccine during a worldwide pandemic. I'm not saying, I mean, honestly, as you know, me being here, I'm more on the distrustful side of things. But I'm just trying to see it from a different angle and really envision what the next pandemic could look like and what the solutions would be besides, I mean, we need a safety net, yes, but I think even looking at this more holistically and more so like looking at the origins of public health, how can we, I guess, how can we prevent a pandemic, but more so on an individual level, how can we maintain our health so that, our immune systems and our systems in general, our communities are just able to resist diseases that inevitably will come up. Maybe that's a
Yeah.
question for a doctor. I don't know, but I'm curious
Yeah, I
what
think
you've been
that
hearing,
no, I think that's
Yeah.
a good point. Because like at the end of the day, we do have to be really careful on what we focus on because there's only so much energy. And so for me right now, I'm trying to focus on how do we help. Like the mRNA technology allows for insane innovations where you can basically micro target little proteins and create antibodies to specific proteins. And so there's the ability or potential for it to really change humanity, in my opinion, and potentially eliminate a lot of disease. However, with that being said, there are people that are going to be genetically susceptible to having injuries to this class of medications and to any medication. Like I said before, even if the government told everyone you need to all take a scoop of peanut butter to save your neighbor, and everyone took a scoop of peanut butter, you're going to kill tens of thousands of people. And it's not that peanut butter is inherently bad or you should not distrust peanut butter, but that's why I'm vehemently against government mandates. I think that the government intervening in someone's own health journey is ridiculous because how can they know your story and your body? And I think that in the future, hopefully, there will be a level of genetic testing to test and understand who is susceptible because a lot of people got the shots and were fine. And so I see that as well. Like my mom was totally fine. My half brother, same mom, different dads, totally fine. My dad, severe reaction, massive stroke. Me, severe reaction, myocarditis, pericarditis, POTS, autoimmune disorder. So it's like there's a genetic predisposition that we could have tested for. And even with some of the cases in the VICP, like the Hannah Poling case where she got $20 million settlement for basically encephalopathy, which is brain swelling that led to symptoms similar to autism. That's what she got granted. And the reason that they granted that $20 million lawsuit is they found she had a mitochondrial dysfunction that was triggered by taking 5 vaccines in one day. And then that mitochondrial dysfunction caused brain swelling, which caused her symptoms. So that's why she was able to get compensated for the $20 million settlement. So it's like then they've done studies and they found that children that have this mitochondrial dysfunction, just genetic predisposition, are highly susceptible to brain swelling or from injuries from vaccines. So it's like at some point, does that mean, I don't know, it's very interesting where we're at right now because we're getting to the point with AI and all this technology on the horizon that we could micro target and specifically say, all right, you have this mutation on this sequence of your genome, therefore this drug is not good for you, or this drug's not good for you. But then people get into the whole idea of, I don't want anyone knowing my DNA or my susceptibilities. And I understand that as well. And so at the end of the day, I think the argument is basically allow people to make their own choices and give them as much honest information as you can. Like just speak the truth and speak it widely and give people the authority to make their own decision. And if someone doesn't want to take a therapeutic in the next pandemic and there's like a severe fatality rate, then that's their decision. Like there's people that don't want to do that and they just want to see, like, if whether they're religious or not, they're saying, I don't want to, and this is how I'm at. So, like, you don't know my body. Maybe in the future they'll have another mRNA technology vaccine and in a further pandemic, and like I would not be a good candidate for that because I know I'm at a higher risk. So it's like, I don't know, it's just very interesting. I think freedom is in a lot of ways like the way out of it, but I also understand that it's a very nuanced subject. And I just don't like the fact that the government, who throughout history has shown to be very corrupt at times, would be mandating people to take something that they're rushing through development. But I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think too few congressmen seem to have read Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. And you read my mind with your point on AI, actually, because as you brought up the genetic dispositions of some folks and their correlations to being susceptible to injuries. Yeah, I was thinking, well, that's another reason why the system is corrupt, because it's not just through AI, but across decades now, our health information has been collected and documented, and we've signed it away. At least to some degree. It's somewhat public, depending on the circumstances. That I think this, from what I gather, listening to you and from the research I've done over the past few years, obviously this is a very complex system and topic, and I'm with you on advocating for individual rights. I don't know what that would look like in the future if we're still kind of grappling with a very materialistic system. It's interesting that there are many, I'll say numerous religious people who were adamantly saying no to the mandates and to the vaccine itself during the pandemic. Why do you think that there's quite the growing group of religious people who fall into this belief system?
I don't know. I had a good conversation with a woman, a PhD researcher from UCSF, who is Indian, and her family back in India was basically kind of saying like, it's up to God, whatever happens to us. And so it's like, I don't know, they just felt at that time, I'm not worried of dying. I embrace death, and whatever comes is what it's meant for me. And so they decided just to wing it. And she was like kind of screaming like, no, and they ended up being fine. They caught COVID and got through it. Obviously, every instance, like every hypothetical, can have a different thing. You could say hypothetically, there's a virus that has a 99% fatality rate and the vaccine is 100% safe and effective. Should everyone take it? And you're like, in that scenario, yes, like, but still people should have the choice. And if they don't want to, like, I don't know, people do things that are kind of silly all the time. So I don't know. I think that a lot of the American thought process boils down at the end of the day to like being afraid of dying and scrambling, like, oh my God, this virus is coming. What if I die? And a lot of the other religious people are just like, yeah, it might be my time. Like it might not be the worst thing. Maybe I'll get to see my grandma or get to see my aunt, or it's like it changes perspective. And when you are a lot less religious, then you're kind of living in the moment like, oh, what if I die? What if this is really scary? I need to save myself. And some of those other people just had a lot more peace with it, and they made their peace and they didn't want to live in fear, and they just operated at their own thing. But I also do think that there is a strong discussion that needs to be had about how your choices affect other people. And I think that that's a very real thing. And if you're making a selfish choice that affects others, then your rights sometimes do get trampled a little bit, such as like if you're at a restaurant and you start smoking a cigarette and there's a mom and three kids behind you inhaling secondhand smoke, that's directly damaging them. That's not fair. Like your rights don't get to impede on other people's rights. So I think that that is something that needs to get talked about as well. But at the end of the day, I don't know, it's just so complicated and it's so nuanced. And I think that that's why there's a lot of importance on like allowing people to try different things and understand their options and choices and just speak to the science that's out there currently and not suppress things like, like the Israeli study in February of 2021. Like, why did they not just tell us that? And then we could have made a decision based on good information. But when you don't give people complete information, you can't get mad at them for making bad decisions. Like, and that's kind of what the government was doing, is like, we're going to withhold all this information. We're going to censor Instagram and Facebook and Google, and we're going to work on like removing these stories. And then we're going to tell you that this thing's safe and effective, and then be surprised why people aren't taking it. And like the last booster in October when we were in Congress, the booster at that point had a 3% uptake. So like 97% of people didn't get, their sixth booster. But I think people are just making their own decision now. And if it was up to the government, it would be mandatory to keep getting boosters every 4 months. Like that's what they would want. And they can argue, oh, it's to protect old people. And it's like that's what they will try to argue in the future. And I get that. Like, I think the thing that I've learned through this whole process is that there's very few absolutes in life, and everything is like this big bag of nuance, and you just have to try your best to kind of navigate it and hopefully operate from a place of empathy and caring about other people, and treat others as you wish to be treated. So that's where I feel like the government failed a lot of us, is like they asked us to do our part for other people, take this shot, safe and effective, do your part, save other people's lives. We did it. Our lives got affected and in many cases ruined. And then the government's like, all right, well, you're on your own. So yeah, that idea of like reciprocal civic duty is kind of the one that I always have in my mind, of how can you ask someone to lend a hand if you're not willing to lend it yourself? But
Mm. And each person has their own idea of what reciprocal civic duty is and what their maybe number one priority is in a given situation, to the kind of the bare minimum of what they'll do for their neighbor when they're most afraid, which made the pandemic incredibly interesting, but also left a lot of people um, isolated, at least for a time. And now, thankfully, at the very least, they're being heard, and at least a little bit being compensated. And I can empathize with your mixed feelings on the complexities of the system, and having some pessimism, having some optimism. But nevertheless, I really admire the work you're doing. And if there's anything I can do, or anybody listening, whatever they can do to support you through React 19, or even just social media, how can they do that?
yeah, I think the biggest thing is that what I'm doing right now is basically like a data gathering mission, with a side of lobbying. So it's like I'm trying to understand this whole story. And I just got off about an hour and a half phone call with a woman named Barbara Loe Fisher, who was one of the women who basically helped get the 1986 passed with Reagan. And so she's been in this battle for 40 years. She has a lot of great insight. The Congress people have a lot of great insight. And I'm meeting with like the Vaccine Petitioner Bar Association next week, meeting with pharma lobbies, all these different people. And so once I kind of package this information and start to share it, if people can help us share it or distribute it, then that would be really helpful. Because I do want to just bring the whole story forward and allow people to understand this is how nuanced it is. Here's where we are. Here are our possible options. And right now, there isn't a lot of light as far as what our possible option is to like really getting through this. There are a couple bills right now. There's the Liable Act, which is from Chip Roy. And so that's one potential way people could look into that. It's Liable. There's also the Doggett bills. There's going to be a new bill coming out next week, for like justice for vaccine injured veterans. So that'll be really interesting. There's Senator Casey's bill, which is basically trying to reform the CICP program. So there's 4 or 5 different pathways that are open to us, and people could just like basically voice support for compensating vaccine injured people across the board, and COVID vaccine injured people. I think that would help a lot.
Right. I think anything we can do to stop the suppression of stories and um, create an understanding or an agreement. My hope is that when each story is brought forward, then we can get a glimpse of the overall human spirit, and maybe Okay, I feel like I'm getting preachy now, but maybe seek a spiritual solution rather than a material one. We'll see what
Yeah.
happens.
Well, I agree. And I think that a lot of that comes down again to that kind of like understanding the perspective of how long your life is and how much there will be after you're gone. And one of the things that I told Barbara, because she's been doing this for 40 years, I was like, you have picked up this stone and carried it for a long time. And I hope that now we can pick it up and carry it again. So it's like, I think that this is going to be a multi-generational challenge, but the hope is that in 50, 100, 150 years that people don't have to face these same injuries in the same way, with lack of compensation. But I don't know. I guess like the short-term goal would be try to get COVID vaccines compensated as soon as possible, help people get coverage, and then in the next, like, hopefully it doesn't take that long, but in the next few years, like really work on trying to reform the whole idea behind vaccine compensation. Because the fact that it's handled differently than every other class of drug is really interesting. And yeah, there's a lot of history as to the reasons why.
And one aspect of having all the information put forward clearly is understanding the twisting of language that's been happening, calling certain things vaccines that in fact are not, rather they're therapies. Could you speak more to certain words that are being misused or skewed in some cases?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. And that's one of the reasons that kind of the people that have been in this a long time are really against the COVID vaccines being added into the vaccine injury program because they, by definition, up until recently, would have not fit the definition of vaccine because they're a gene therapy, like therapeutic agent. And so with that, it's like if if we change the definition of vaccine to allow these to fit it, then where do they go? How, like, why are they being handled as vaccines? Again, this is an interesting incentive structure because with the liability protections that pharmaceutical companies get from vaccines, then it's kind of incentivizing these to be put in that program. And that's what pharma wants as well. So that's like, there's a little bit of friction because pharma actually wants what we want, which is to get into the VICP because for them, it gives them liability shields in perpetuity. So like they would have COVID vaccine liability shields forever. But then we want it because that seems to be the only program that's not completely broken. Like it's only 80% broken instead of CICP is like 95% broken. But then again, if we do congressional action to get into the VICP, then it could potentially open up that possibility of amendments or pharma coming in and changing things for the worse. So it's like, I don't know what to do. And that's why I think we need a lot of smart people on it. And I feel like we need to communicate it out to the world in a way that people can jump in and like offer perspective and opinions. Um, I think one of the really interesting things that's possible is Robert Kennedy has he was giving a lecture basically on this idea of the Dalbert threshold. That's something people could look into, but the Dalbert threshold is essentially this idea that to bring a lawsuit to a court, you have to have a certain threshold of scientific studies supporting the hypothesis you're trying to prove. And a lot of times there's just not good quality scientific studies that are in abundance enough to like prove that these things are linked or causal. And so the reason he was able to sue Monsanto and really do this like massive $100+ million lawsuit on behalf of a guy that got cancer is because they had surpassed the Dalbert threshold and there was enough good studies linking this type of cancer to the Roundup or glyphosate. So what he's talked about is the way out of this really is allowing the free market to take action. And the way you do that is you fund the studies necessary to show what's actually happening with people and get over that Dalbert threshold, and then let the lawyers come in and just like sue the companies into a mission, essentially. And so that's kind of like that's the only way to really, really, really change things is pull back the liability shields and then allow the Dalbert threshold to be met so that lawyers can come in and actually prove that these things are happening at the rate that they are and get all the discovery on like the trial data, get discovery on all the redacted documents, like, and actually see the truth because the truth is the only way to like actually set this free. Um, and so, yeah, the only way you get truth is through discovery. Otherwise, no one will tell you what's actually happening. So, and the only way you get discovery is if you can bring a lawsuit, and the only way you can bring a lawsuit is if you repeal the liability shields. So at the end of the day, like this shield is really protecting the companies more than it really maybe seems on the surface.
Right. And as much as the independent investigation of truth is crucial for every individual, I think adjacent to the spirit of discovery is inviting consultation. And, I admire you for being one of those many voices. And again, Kyle, it really was a pleasure to virtually meet you, and I wish you the best.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry for all the tangents, but this is a very complex issue, as I'm sure you can see. And the one kind of, I guess, like heartening thing is every person I meet with, like every staffer and legislative aide and pharmaceutical lobbyist and all these people, they all say this is the hardest issue they've ever worked on. So this is like, I think, the most complicated thing at the moment, and we're trying to figure it out. And however I can help with that is great. And anything you guys can do to help is awesome as well. So thank you so much.
Of course. Of course. All right. Take care, Kyle.
Yeah, thank you.